Okay, everyone, welcome to this meeting. This is a special meeting for BuzzTouch developers on how we can use um, some of the software that's available to us to make apps accessible for people who have disabilities. And LA is the leader of a group that's called BuzztouchAbility, and the BuzztouchAbility group is sponsoring this meeting today. And they worked together, and LA was our leader and wrote some things that we wanted to know about. And LA has put that information into the chat window so you could all see what we knew to be things that we'd want to learn how to do in our apps. David also, I talked to David yesterday. He had some other ideas about what we want to do to put into our apps to make our apps more accessible. And from this meeting today, LA is going to draft something that will be a document that will be available to all BuzzTouch users on how they can make their apps more accessible. I'm also hoping that we'll get accessibility features added to our plugins. So there's a lot of good things that can come out of this today. Um, I'm going to turn it over to David at this point, and then I'll start unmuting people one by one once I figure out where the latency problem is coming from. Go ahead, David. Oh, let me
Yeah, so it's
give you
nice
the
to
screen here, David.
see everybody back. Let's not share my screen yet. I'm just kind of, I mean,
Oh, okay.
we can do it, but it's fine. You're just going to see everybody's face in the corner or whatever. But I'll open up Objective-C so we can look at something.
Okay.
Yeah, so well said, Sue. That's exactly the intent of this meeting. And without LA's kind of spearheading this thing, we probably wouldn't be getting to this point already. So it's awesome that we are. So we're going to talk about a couple of different things today, and if you can see your faces up in the right-hand corner, excuse me, but I like leaving them on my screen so I can see everybody. But fundamentally, I think that there's quite a bit of confusion out there about this word accessibility, right? What does that mean? Why is it important to understand it? Why it's actually not that difficult to understand if you just kind of learn some basics, and in terms of we'll talk a little bit about what it is and why it's important, and then the other thing that we're going to talk about is a little bit of kind of developer enthusiasm in terms of being super my camera keeps moving around here. It being really enthusiastic about trying to make their apps somehow different so that they can call them accessible, and how I think, and a lot of people in the industry think, that that's actually not a very good approach. And we'll talk about what I mean by that. So what is accessibility? What is this idea of trying to make our apps different and trying to making them accessible? And then we'll get into a little bit of technical stuff in terms of, like, concretely, how do you make certain things accessible? And then I think the goal is today to kind of make sure we all understand the meaning of all of this, so that as we move forward, we can keep it in our minds as developers and why it's important and how it should always be part of our development thinking, our process. And then B, like Susan said, maybe as we move into the future, we can start to make it easier to make our apps more accessible using the control panel and using plugins and all of that kind of stuff. And so I imagine there's going to be a bunch of questions, which is fine. I think we're going to try to keep this meeting to about an hour, but they generally roll over a little bit, and that's fine too. So we'll kind of shoot with that. And so LA sent me a nice little document the other day with some of the ideas that he was thinking of, and he's also pasted those in the chat window. And so it's kind of the same concept, and he's asking some pretty standard questions. How do we make elements accessible? How do we manage things like font size and colors and things like that? And these all make perfect sense. So we're going to start off by talking a little bit about what accessibility is. And so prior to mobile and phones and devices and tablets, if you ask somebody what accessibility meant, they would almost always be talking about web pages, exclusively talking about web pages. And when we talk about making a web page accessible, it's a lot of the same ideas in mobile, but there are some differences. And the key difference is this. In a browser, if you're, let's say, visually impaired, let's say you're blind, and you have a computer and you load up a web page that obviously has some content on it that you can't see, you're going to need another third-party or add-on piece of software to help you read that screen and it helped you experience that screen in your browser. So put ourselves 10 years ago. And so there were all different kinds of attempts made to make reader plugins and accessibility plugins and different kinds of tools. And actually there were computers that came out and all these different kind of ambitious goals to try to help blind people experience the web. And so if you extend that to other types of accessibility issues, like maybe there's audio that you can't hear, and maybe there's, I guess audio and visual would be the only things on the web. But the point is there was a lot of work that went into that, and it always involved the browser plus some kind of an add-on to make it work. And then the last thing that it involved was the programmer writing the HTML in a way that would help the reader or help the tool speak it or navigate it so that the person using the website could experience it in the way that it was intended. And what they found was the more effort that you put into trying to develop a web page that was specifically accessible for these tools, the kind of more messy it got. Right, and think of the days where you were trying to struggle with understanding web standards and all these different things, and really what it boiled down to was, and where they kind of landed in the and this is web page days, is if you just coded a good high quality HTML document, meaning it didn't break any of the HTML rules and it used headers where it's supposed to have headers and it used paragraphs where it was supposed to have paragraphs, and the images had alt tags and everything was the way it was supposed to be, you didn't need to do anything else. And these readers did an amazing job at rendering quality HTML in a really good way. And so they learned that there might not be a lot of extra effort made or necessary. There might not be a lot of extra effort necessary on the developer's part, as long as those standards were followed in terms of the web developing. So flashing forward to mobile and jumping till now, a lot of the concepts are the same, with one big key difference. One big key difference. And the biggest difference is the person who's using the device, the iPhone or the iPad or the Android gadget, doesn't need any kind of add-on. They don't need to go understand that they need a reader or an audio, visualizer or whatever, because the devices already have built-in capabilities to do a lot of these things. And that's very important because as we're designing apps and we're making plugins and we're making screens, it's easy for us to lose sight of that as, able-bodied developers, right? We can see, we can hear, we can do all this kind of stuff, and it's very easy to lose sight of it. So we want to always, the number one rule, of course, is we want to always be mindful of the fact that a user might have set up their device to experience our app differently than we thought, differently than we might have intended them to. And that's not a bad thing, but it is the case. Like, for example, in iOS, I don't know if a lot of you know this or not, but if you go to Settings in iOS and you choose Accessibility, let me find it here. Oh, General. Accessibility. If you turn on Assistive Touch, this is just one example. You see this little bug that's on the screen now on my phone that I can move around? This is a little bug that will open up a menu for me. And that bug will persist throughout all of the applications. See, now I'm in the iTunes player and I can open up my little bug. So I didn't depend on a developer to allow me to do that. The phone has already got lots of things built in. I said it's already got, that's some broken English. The phone already has lots of features built in that will allow me to take advantage of some of these accessibility features that the developer was mindful of. Which takes us kind of to our next topic. And by the way, I always forget to turn these things off, and then I don't know why my phone's behavior changes, so let me get that turned off. But anyway, so the readers and the accessibility tools that we used to have to add to browsers in the old days no longer are necessary. The phones already do it. So we have to be mindful of that. So the next logical question is well, what do they do? And how do they know? In other words, if I'm looking at a photo browsing app that Jake made, and it's got a bunch of photos in it, and I can't see, why would I be looking at photos? I mean, it's a silly question, But I would imagine that a lot of people who can't see enjoy browsing Facebook, right? Even though a lot of Facebook content is rich and visual, if it's described properly and it's laid out properly, my world, because I can't see, revolves around understanding this experience and taking in this experience in my way, even though I can't see the photos. And so in our photo app, maybe if we were a little mindful of that and maybe describe the pictures a little bit better and maybe kind of talk to the operating system and helped it with that person who couldn't see, then we were better off. So really that's all you're doing is you're, as a developer, you're saying to yourself, hey, I can help the operating system learn a little bit about my app in a way that is not technical. That the phone's going to do the describing and the navigating, you know, through swipes and touches and all that. But I can help it a little bit. So if you don't help it, it's going to work relatively well, actually. But if you do help it, it can work much, much better. And so the goal as a developer in mobile, when you're thinking of accessibility, is you want to be able to help the operating system understand what your app is supposed to look like and do. And the way that you do that is you basically describe it to iOS. And we'll get into a little bit of the details around that. But I just said a bunch of stuff that really just means that this is not that complicated. It's being mindful of the people that use devices that have limitations, and it's being mindful that your operating system, iOS or Android, is already trying to figure out what your app's doing and meaning, even if you don't intend it to, and you can help it understand your app's purpose and style and design and content in a pretty significant way with not a lot of work. And so that's kind of the goal of this. And so do you think we should take some questions now, Sue, before we move on? I mean, I don't mind. Should we open up the chat thing, or should I just keep going?
Yeah, everyone's unmuted, so LA has himself muted, so people can just go ahead and ask questions if they'd like to.
Yeah, so why don't we take a second? Does everybody understand what I just said, or was that just a bunch of rambling?
Questions about accessibility in apps, not general questions.
Right, right.
We're trying to get
Exactly.
a topic here.
Exactly.
Maybe at
And
the
if we
end
don't
we
get
can
any,
take a few
that's
general
fine.
questions.
Okay, so if we don't have any, that's cool. Somebody interrupt me. I tend to lose sight of the chat window if you see a question come up. So let's jump in and let's...
There's a long explanation in the chat window of what the BuzztouchAbility group came up with as things that we thought would be helpful for accessibility.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, so let's jump to the two guiding documents and the two guiding principles that iOS and Apple publish and that Android publish, because I think this is really, really important. So I'm going to change it today and start with Android instead of iOS, because I usually start with iOS, but we'll change it around a little bit. Okay. And I want you to see here that in Android's world, they have a very, very simple definition of what accessibility is. So Android and Google say accessibility is the measure of how successfully a product can be used by people with varying abilities. Pretty simple. So the product is your app, and it's accessible, and they have a measurement of like how accessible is it. So if you had to imagine putting a scale on it, right? Like mine might be a 2 out of 10, yours could be like an 8 out of 10, but Google says it's the measurement of how successful it can be used by people with varying abilities. Now let's jump over here to the iOS side. And this is interesting too. The iOS document, and I'll share these links here in the chat window, because these are really, really important. So there's the iOS accessibility link, and here's the Android accessibility link. iOS has a different definition. iOS says, let's see if we can find it on here. I copied it right here. I'll just read it this way. iOS says an application is accessible when user interface elements with which users can interact are accessible. A user interface element is accessible when it properly reports itself as an accessible element. So I know that's kind of double talking, it's talking around in a circle, but there's a big difference here. iOS is very clearly saying if there's something on the screen, it is or isn't accessible. A button, a view, a list, a map, that thing, that UI element, that user interface element, the little slider, it either is or isn't accessible. And it is accessible if A user interface element is accessible when it properly reports itself as an accessibility element. In other words, the developer has taken the time to say this thing is accessible. That's a little bit different than Android. Android's saying it's just a measurement on how useful your app is for somebody with, you know, challenges. That's a completely different philosophy. And so whether you agree with one or agree with the other, you know, who am I to judge that kind of stuff? But I can tell you that in iOS you have a relatively fine control. You have a lot of controls that you can do as a programmer in iOS that you don't have in Android. And so before we get to the technical stuff, let's talk about how you describe an element in Objective-C as accessible. Because remember, it's not accessible, they tell you right here, unless it properly reports itself as accessible. So let's jump on in the Objective-C here, and let's just, I'm just on a menu buttons plugin screen, so we're working with a UI button. So you set all these properties of a button, right? What's its label, what's its frame, what's its color, what does it do? It's just a UI button. So if we take, in this case, we're working with something called this button. So the easiest way sometimes is to just use the code complete and type in, you know, set, and then I usually start with the letter A because I know accessibility is ACCESS, and I look at the tips here. Look at all these different things that you can set, different properties that you can set on this button that are just related to accessibility, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different things that we can describe to the operating system about this button. And this is one button, right? So most people don't go through the pains of understanding and setting all of these different things. If you wanted to get really kind of intense and hyperactive about how accessible your app is, you might set a couple of them. For example, you might set the hint and you might set the label. And I'll describe to you what those two things are. When I'm using the accessibility features in iOS, the operating system is going to oftentimes speak to me, assuming I can't see and I can't hear. It's going to speak to me maybe the label on the button or the hint on the button or the description. And so these values that you set for your button, like this takes a string, right? Like if we wanted to take the accessibility, hint, we would create a string here and say this button loads images, something like that.
So that would come up on VoiceOver then if you did that?
Exactly.
Oh,
exactly.
Okay. So that's all I gotta do to make VoiceOver work. That's cool.
So the operating system is going to try to do this on its own. On some elements it does really well, even if you've not worked at making it accessible, because things like, for example, a button, they have text on it. So it's going to make the assumption that the text on the button means something like play or stop or, you know, rewind or next or previous, right? Simple things. But if it's a unique button that does something unique, it's not often as accurate as it could be if you set these hints and these descriptions. So the key takeaway here is with iOS, there's lots of different things you can tell it about each element on the screen. And that's, iOS is going back to Apple's definition. It's user interface element by user interface element, each element. So that's quite a bit different than Android, which we'll get to in just a sec. The other cool thing about iOS is, because we have Interface Builder, in your little inspector panel on the right, when you're setting up the Interface Builder elements and you're dragging things around and you're describing them using Interface Builder, there's an accessibility panel or pane that you can type in a lot of these things to make it easier if you're a visual type of a person. I'm a code guy, so I tend to do it in code, but if you're a visual type person and you're using Interface Builder, you can describe each element. And then the last thing, of course, is we can't lose sight of the fact that it needs to be localized, right? French, English, German. That's another question altogether, but the point is 3 different topics. Your UI looks a certain way. Your UI is described a certain way to the accessibility engine in iOS. And then you have this language issue where you need to localize it. But that's kind of the concept. Very fine control over every one of these elements. Android, on the other hand, let's go to Android. Back to our little browser here. And this is surprising to me, frankly. And maybe Android's got this figured out, and maybe iOS is too fine-grained controlled. They're saying really all you're going to do in every little element is set the content description. Let me find out where they say that in here. Yeah, content description. So if I'm looking at an Android project, let's open up an Android project and we'll go to a layout file. Layout. We'll just do whatever, this menu list. I'm just going to open this up in a text editor. So we have an Android layout that those of us who have worked in Android know what an Android layout is. It's a descriptive file that describes how all the user interface elements are put together in a layout file. And it's XML, and we put in text views and buttons and images and all those kinds of things. So we could set the content description equals, this is a text box, or could say this is password box, right? So you describe what each element is using the content description tag in your layout files. So the reason that I'm fascinated by this is, on one hand, that seems quite a bit more simple than iOS, and where we have all of these different things that we can describe, like its size and its color and its position, and does it animate, and its hint, and it's just all these different things, 10 different things we saw on one button, versus one thing on this text view. And it would be the same thing if this was a button. You'd still only have this one thing, content description. And so if you read the Android doc, or their description of what they think accessibility is, which by the way is one short web page, the iOS programming guide is like 50 pages or something. It's a much more kind of minimal approach. Now, I can't be the judge of determining if that's enough or not. But it does seem to me that if you give something a description, and Android can read that, it seems to me that the operating system should know a lot of this other stuff, like what color it is and what position it has on the screen and where it lives in the UI. So maybe Google's got this figured out. Maybe they're saying, hey, that's all we need, and our operating system is smart enough to know that you don't need to burden the developers with all these other options. So I've not done a tremendous amount of programming with iOS or Android as it relates to accessibility. Right? The funny part for me is every time I start experimenting with my phone in like languages, like Miguel had me doing backflips the other night, I was like frustrated because I changed the language and I couldn't get it back because I couldn't read. I set it to Japanese or whatever, and I was like, ah! So the same thing happens with the accessibility stuff. I'll set all these weird options on my phone, and then I won't understand what it's doing because I don't spend enough time with the phone in that mode to really truly understand how this is helping me or not. So I tend to not get it as much as I'd like to. I think it would be fantastic to team up with a blind person or a deaf person and try to do development with that actual perspective. I think that would be awesome. And I don't know how that could be done, but I guess what I'm saying is I suspect that you guys are going to run into the same thing. It's hard to know how successful you are at these things unless you have an actual use case. Hey, there he is.
Actually, Ian's got one. Ian has a pitch pipe, and he has this someone that's blind, some blind choir, wants that pitch pipe to have the voiceover. So I think when he watches this video, he probably will have what he needs to make that. But they've been asking him for several months to make that app into an app that they could use for the choir of blind people.
Yeah, and that brings up a great point too, because so far we've described what is accessible in two concrete kind of nerdy ways, right? We described it in Apple's way where they said, you know, accessibility is, where was my document here? You know, an application is accessible when all user interface elements that people interact with are accessible. When it's properly reporting its accessibility features and all that kind of stuff. And Android said accessibility is a measurement of how useful the thing is to somebody with varying abilities. But if you, so those are technical descriptions, but if you asked a customer, hey, what do you mean make it accessible? They're oftentimes going to say things that are a little bit more human. And they will oftentimes describe to you things like, well, I want to swipe side to side and make the pitch pipe play. Well, that's a totally different question, right?
Yeah, exactly. Oh, it might be my computer, but everyone froze.
Really different thing because accessible, because we know that blind people use their phone in accessibility kind of modes. There is a difference in those things. And so a perfect example, let's take his variable font size question. I think it's, all of us have seen the plus and minus buttons on a web browser. You know, you'll go to a web page and in the upper right, like newspaper sites were famous for this, right? Make the font bigger, make the font smaller, and they'd have little pluses and minuses, and they would change the CSS style sheet based on my selections, and I'd have big font, little font. I mean, I use on my Mac, I use Command plus and Command minus all the time to make the screen zoom in and zoom out, because some sites have smaller font than others, and I'm going blind and all that kind of stuff. But let's think about what LA is saying. He's saying, hey, how do I make an app that has variable font sizes? On one hand, I could say, well, you don't. The user's going to zoom in with his accessibility stuff that's built into his phone already. So if you make an app with giant font and then he zooms in on that, remember, it might be completely a bad experience because he's used to all his other apps kind of conforming to a norm that you've now jumped outside of. And it might work great if he's not using the built-in zoom features. But as soon as he does use the built-in zoom features, your app is almost useless because you've thought, hey, I'm trying to help somebody. Right? And so that's an interesting question. But that's a different question than saying, hey, I want an app where I can tap something and have that screen zoom in and then tap it again and have it zoom out. That's a little different. And so there's a
limitation
feature
to zooming though, David, because then the zooming makes it go off the screen, and you want the text to be just a different font size so that it'll wrap and stay on the page.
Exactly, exactly. So I would say that there's always going to be some kind of a balance there. There's always going to be some kind of a balance there. And certainly you'd have to decide, am I making this specifically for people with a certain accessibility issue or not? But as it relates to, like, can I make everything bigger or everything smaller? It isn't reasonable to have let's say a global button on your app to increase the font sizes of everything. Right? That's just not reasonable. You could do it. It would be challenging. And everywhere you had font, you'd have to somehow describe that it's going to have to figure out its size from this function or something like that. I would spend my time describing to the user. I would have like an accessibility screen or something. This is the way I would do it. And I would say, hey, if you want to view this app with bigger font, tap here, which opens up the accessibility app on the phone, right to the font size thing. I would just help them understand that their phone already does this. I suspect that they already know it does that, though. I would have a hard time justifying engineering features in my app that are already in iOS. That's like zoom and zoom out. That's all I'm saying there. But the reason I'm bringing up this question, though, is it's hard to distinguish the difference between a feature, my app does something cool, and an accessibility element or idea. So that's interesting. Same thing with like grayscale, right? Do I have two versions of my app, one grayscale and one color scale? Or do I just say, hey, go to the accessibility panel and set it to grayscale? Because it'll already do it for you. Is it a feature or is it an understanding? I don't really know the answer to that question, but it's important to have to raise the dialogue, and, you know, with these topics. I think the most significant thing that you can do is describe the element, and that's it. Just describe it. In iOS, just set the description. In Android, just set the content description. And you will be amazed at how your users will appreciate that. I've only done 2 projects where that was part of the specification. And one of them, it was part of the specification as in you're not going to get paid unless this is like this. And that was fine. And so it was no big deal. Everybody knew it was going to be that way, and it worked out great. The other one was a little bit of a surprise in that the developer and I, or the customer and I, we kind of surprised them and showed them that we went through the effort to do this, and they were so excited that we took the extra step to do that because, as it turns out, one of their employees couldn't see, and they expected to kind of fumble through the app, and turns out they didn't have to fumble through the app because we described all the elements, and they were super, super stoked about it. And so how you approach that, you know, kind of depends. It's a little bit of a shame that we don't have that in our minds already automatically.
Yeah,
Like
but
maybe,
we have to actually do it in a plugin too. So now we're using BuzzTouch and we have like a simple menu, and
yeah,
we'll have to add like fields too. Well, maybe that would be an opportunity for a developer that wanted to specialize in that,
yeah.
to have like a simple menu or a button menu that allowed a field that you could describe for the sake of accessibility in your
Totally,
control panel.
totally. And ideally, it would be wonderful to brag about how all these plugins support that, right? So if we had the accessibility and kind of the language localization kind of thing taken care of, I totally understand. I totally agree. But my point is, or the point I was trying to get at is this. I don't think it would be a stretch. I don't think it would be a stretch for, let's say, a company like Apple to make these things mandatory,
That's
right?
true.
I mean, it would take a big stand.
Hmm.
And it would take a big voice like Google saying, you know what, your app doesn't describe every element. It's not good.
Hmm.
Right? I'm surprised we don't do that already.
Hmm.
It's kind of a shame that we don't,
Hmm.
right? Because think of the improvements of all of the apps if they just simply required it. What would happen is we'd be frustrated in the beginning as developers because it's another thing we got to fill in and it's another thing we got to deal with. But eventually it would just become old hat and it would just be normal. And then it wouldn't be a frustrating thing, and all the apps would be better, and we'd have a bigger customer base, and the people who couldn't hear could experience the people who couldn't see. I think it'd just be better, but for whatever reason, it's not required, and that's kind of a shame, I think.
Hmm.
And so LA can probably speak to that. He's, you know, for those of you who don't know, LA's in a wheelchair, and he probably runs into things every day that ought to not be that way, but they are, right? So he's got to deal with it. And so I think we're making improvements in that regard, and we've all heard of the ADA and some of these sometimes overreaching laws. I mean, obviously there's a balance, but yeah, I think in programming we can do better as an industry than we are, and maybe we can lead a little of that, right? Maybe we can start to think about those things. I mean, I need it too. I'm no saint. You know, I pass these things up in trade-off for efficiency also. But localization and accessibility have always been a big problem. Always. Everybody thinks they're like us. I think everyone's like me, therefore I don't need to do this stuff. And so it's a challenge. But those are the two core ideas.
Those are the two core ideas.
Apple and iOS and Android and Google basically are just trying to describe your elements to the user. They use the description to do that. And it's not, in my opinion, about building in features into your app. It's about building in the proper kind of description stuff for all of the elements. But so let's open that up for conversation a little bit, and maybe we can go from there. I think that we wanted to talk about swiping. I'm not quite sure where that came from, but in LA's questions earlier on.
Let's give LA the floor for a second here. I can tell you unmuted because also we have this big latency problem here. LA, go ahead, LA.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Well, not all apps you can zoom.
Okay.
So I got to disagree with you there.
Okay.
And not all apps can make use of the voiceover either. You understand what I'm getting at?
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. I mean, with Android, you can go to the interface builder, put contact description right there, where it says contact description, and it does it for you. Or you can go to iOS and bring up the analyzer or the inspector, and right under with the hint or label, you can just do that. But I would also kind of caution when you're doing a play button, it always says play. So you might confuse the individual also.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's a good point. So what would you think that I think a lot of this takes, again, because I'm not blind, none of us are blind in this meeting. It's hard to know what the description should be. You certainly wouldn't want iOS to read the play on the button and then read the play in the description. So then it's going to say play, play, right? That's corny. So LA brings up a great point. Your description should probably be more of a sentence, maybe. Tap this button to start the song or something like that. Yeah, that's a great question. Now, as far as the zooming, LA, I'm going to go back to the zooming thing. Maybe I'm missing something, but I can have my phone zoom in on anything.
Yeah,
on iOS. I don't know about Android. I don't have my gadget with me.
But say you're reading something and you're reading a newspaper and the text is too small and you want to make it bigger and you zoom. Now you got this big scrolling problem with the larger size. It'd be better if it would just go to a larger font size and wrap and stay in my screen. But I think you could handle that too with kind of like we do with internationalization is having two config files with two different font sizes. So you would have, or maybe setting something so that you could have maybe it would be like setting like each plugin so that it had like a variable font size. Or, well, a lot of things you could do, but.
No, there's no doubt that features like that would be awesome. We just need to make sure that we don't do a bunch of work as developers, all of us, that contradicts what the thing already does. That's all I'm saying, because and I'm calling these features, if you've got an app that does something cool, like helps a blind person see font without the scrolling problem like Susan's talking about, and now it just goes down the screen like it's supposed to, yeah, that's awesome. I would call that a feature. Mm-hmm. However, how do I know that feature's there? I don't know. I mean, if I'm already zoomed into my phone, yeah, that's an interesting point you're bringing up there, LA, about like the zoom. Maybe it's not, maybe there's just a way to make it better rather than relying on the built-in.
Let me give you an example.
Rather than relying on the built-in stuff.
Let me give you an example. And this is more about, okay, I just opened up Buzzcast. On the main menu, you can't pinch a zoom. Okay? If I tap the show, it goes to another menu, you can't zoom. If I tap about the show, you're getting to an HTML, there I can zoom, pinch. But on the menus, you cannot. You know what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so on your phone, is this an iOS or Android?
This is iOS.
Did you set the zooming and the accessibility to on? See, on mine, if I put zoom on, watch what it does. Everything's super close and the whole screen moves around. It's giant. See how large the icons are now? They're huge because I turned zooming on. So if I open up the Buzzcast app, which, yeah, I'm going to have to find, there's no doubt about it that I need to understand how to pinch and zoom it and pan it around. I'm not contradicting. I'm just asking, like, it doesn't zoom can mean a lot of different things, right? But iOS will absolutely make everything on the screen bigger.
Well, and I turned it on, and of course it brought everything out of the window.
Looks crazy, yeah. It doesn't look good at all.
But I guess when I say zoom, is when I could take and pinch and zoom it, and make it big.
Yeah.
You still can't do it on a menu.
I think a better way to do it.
And I'm assuming this is what, a menu with an image he's using?
Probably, I have no idea. Now that I've got my phone all zoomed in, I can't find anything.
Oh yeah, I'm just playing with it here. The triple tap works, but not the pinch and zoom when you triple tap.
Triple tap, you said?
If you turn on Zoom, the triple tap will zoom a BuzzTouch menu, but the pinch and zoom will not.
One thing we might do, and this is crazy thinking, like, this is just a creative guy thinking. It would be relatively, I don't want to use the word easy, but it would be doable. Remember the goofy little magnifying glasses you could drag around the screen back in the day? Like you could magnify a certain part of a screen?
Yeah.
I wonder if it would be worthwhile to put a layer on top of the app. This would be part of the BuzzTouch core. You could put a layer on top that would be somehow activated that would allow you to pinch and zoom anything underneath it. Like, so if you're on a button menu or you're on a quiz screen or whatever, if it just had this overlay that it would zoom in or magnify or whatever, that might be kind of interesting. And so I love these ideas of getting creative like that in terms of, because you've got a BuzzTouch app, you've got these features available to you, as long as we're sensitive to the built-in stuff. Right? We don't want to get so crazy. Like, we don't want to come up with our own way to describe elements if there's already a built-in way to do that. But you're right, LA. I mean, I just put the zoom on my phone. That is unusable. It's horrible. I mean, you just can't even use it.
Well, I also thought of something that we might be able to do. You guys know large text?
Uh-huh.
If we could possibly incorporate the large text into the menus, like if you set large text and then you go to messages, then your messages and even that it looks like a simple menu becomes larger font size. So if there's some kind of accessibility panel that we can enable when you tap large text, that it'll increase the size of a menu. That would probably be easy, and then you don't even have to worry about the zooming or anything like that. It all fits
right
with it.
Oh, yeah.
So another interesting question, and I'll have to do a little research on this, is I wonder if we can use, I don't know if you've all heard the word introspection. I wonder if we can ask the device as developers what the current accessibility settings are. In other words, does this user have large text on? Does this user have, because if we knew that, like let's say your app could discover that, well then like Jake's saying, you might not want to use a certain font size in the menu because he's already increased it. But if he hadn't already increased it, yeah, I'm thinking out loud, like and the root question there is I wondered, I don't know this answer, can we discover what the current accessibility selections are? Now, I think that there might be a privacy issue there. It's very rare that iOS will let you discover anything about the user's selections in their properties and their general choices and all those kinds of things. Because think about it, if I'm a developer and I know that you've got, hearing impaired option on, well, I can come to some conclusions now about you, and now I can market things to you, and I can do all kinds of things to you that frankly aren't any of my business as an app developer. So it might be that they don't let us look into these properties, but I think it's worth asking the question, like, okay, what can I learn about the settings? That's frustrating. Now that I'm thinking about it, I doubt that they will let us do that. I doubt that they will let us. So how else could you do it, LA? Could you ask them when the app launched? Like Miguel asks them a language now, right? And he runs multiple language files, and he gives them a choice, which is cool. It's a spin on on localization, because he's not relying on the phone to do it. His app is taking responsibility to say, what language do you want? And that's a great thing. I wonder if it would be worthwhile to have like an accessibility settings screen in your app that asks them some questions that they're now volunteering the answers to, because we can't ask iOS or Android, hey, is this person blind? Right? So maybe there's a screen that says, set up your accessibility option. I don't know. I mean, that would be kind of cool.
Yeah. And
then the platform could act accordingly. It could zoom, it could speak, it could do all kinds of stuff.
Well, as the market gets more saturated, the more we can do with this, it gives BuzzTouch an edge. It gives us as developers an edge if we can make our apps more accessible and have people like if Ian makes that pitch pipe for blind people and they tell other people about Ian's apps, he might have like a little niche there with the blind community, you know.
Oh, there's no doubt. There's no doubt. In many, many situations, I'm sure that there's applications that are just known in those verticals as the best choice for that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're congregating with, you know, a certain crowd and you guys can't hear, whatever, you all know probably what's the best game or app or whatever. I had a little bit of an eye-opening, and this is how I got exposed to it. If you guys go to the About Us page and you read about this whole college thing, remember BuzzTouch started as a project in college, and what ended up happening was, and I was quite embarrassed about this whole thing, but the short version of it is we had this capstone presentation day. We had all of these students presenting what their capstone project. So BuzzTouch was my capstone project. And I was this old guy who, you know, returning student, everybody's young. I'm like this old dude getting another college degree, and it was kind of funny. At any rate, so people were impressed by what I'd done, and it was a big deal, and everything was cool. Well, I gave my presentation, and everybody applauded and cheered, and they knew that this was going to be cool. And this blind guy walks up, shakes my hand, got his cane, tells me, cool, I listened to what you said, blah, blah, blah. But I'm swiping through this app here, and it's useless. This whole idea of accessibility was just a joke to him because I didn't think of that. And he talked about the community we had, and he talked about, you know, the audience, and here I was on day one basically already embarrassed because we didn't think of it. And the point I'm trying to make is, even with that, even with these conversations, right, it's hard to make these things a priority. And we have to first decide what it is as developers that we're going to think about and do. Mm-hmm. Then we got to execute on it as good as we possibly can, as well as we possibly can. So I think, you know, we might not be the right people to ask, we in this audience right here, how this should be done. Because we're not blind, we're not deaf, right? Maybe there's an answer that we don't know yet. And it might be interesting to poll around and ask some folks, hey, how do you think we should do this? We've got all these apps that are built on this common, you know, background or platform. You think we should put a Zoom thing over the top of it? You think we should describe them differently? I don't know. It might be a fun.
Well, that's what the BuzztouchAbility group will coordinate.
Okay.
Well, what we'll do is the group will continue to meet and work on it. Ellie's going to write this kind of how-to, and then what we'll probably do is like have recommendations for BuzzTouch that say, okay, we researched it and we think the priority is whatever we decide. We'll come up with recommendations for what we think is priority, and then we'll do that research and find out what people need the most and what would help the most, and also hopefully prioritize that for BuzzTouch because it's limited resource. We can't just, you know, do everything today, and so
yeah,
I think that'd be our
another point too. You guys are about to been working my butt off on this plug-in dilemma that we had, like how do you make them and get them in the market and get them approved, and we're automating all this stuff so we can get the volume up. And one of the things that we could do, and this is crazy, but we could do it, is we could just take that leap that I talked about Apple making and say, you know what, it has to be accessible. It has to be. Yeah. In the panel, you're getting ready to make your plug-in buttons and views and widgets and windows. You got to describe each one.
Let's not do that yet. But yeah, I know. Yeah, once we get everything more
eventually,
stable,
when you're looking in the market, it can have a little icon or something that says this has accessibility properties or something like that.
Yeah.
That are easy to set, or you know, that might be kind of cool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I don't see anything wrong with that because all they got to do is set the content description.
Yeah.
It's one word, or I mean, it's not that hard to do. Mm-hmm. And if there's a PDF to show you how to do it, then, like you said, you could put an icon in Google Play or Apple says, you know, it's accessible for certain people. And
yeah.
Like I said,
so how do we move forward? How do we come up to it with an action plan, or what do we, quote, do about this? I mean, it's one thing to show. I'm happy to teach technical concepts as much as I can, right? I don't mind saying, look, you can use Xcode and you can set an accessibility problem on a button, you know, easy, right? Just by using the code hints and choosing the description stuff. That's relatively low-level thinking. Mm-hmm. how do we? What I'm not good at is, what are the steps? What is the roadmap? And maybe LA and LA's group can try to map out like what we should do in terms of, ideals, and then Sue and I, and maybe figure out where it falls on the priority list or whatever. I think that's important.
Yeah.
But I don't know where that falls.
Well, yeah,
Joe
I
can
think his next steps, and maybe we should wrap up so we can turn off the recording because these recordings get so long, and I think that will help them
Okay.
be in sync better if they're shorter. But maybe we kind of wrap up
Yeah.
and say that next steps is we bring this back to the BuzztouchAbility group, which will probably meet in a week or so, and then take that what we got from learning from here, and then start to shape this how-to document, and then possibly have some guidance for developers on making plugins. And then we'll also come back to BuzzTouch and have maybe recommendations for BuzzTouch that will be prioritized because we can't do everything right away. It's
Right.
like there's so many plugins. Like say we're going to add a new field to a plugin so that you could actually enter your description line by line or field by field.
Uh-huh.
There's a lot of plugins, and it's not like you can
Right.
just do that. And it's just a big project, so we kind of have to
Yep.
prioritize and we'll go from there. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to turn off the recording, but the meetings won't be over, okay? So we can stay on the phone.